Mary Will I Die, Chapter 2 by Sean Sarles. This is Calvin's perspective. Well, it's an outside narrator, but looking in on Calvin and what's happening with him. The clamor, that's a noise, the clamor in the cafeteria was overwhelming as Calvin got in line to get his food. He liked the noise, though, craved it even. He opened his ears and let the chaos fill him up. Trays clattered as they were set down on tables. Forks and spoons tapped out their own percussion line. Mouths chewed, teeth chomped, and tore between stories told. Jokes were made, and dates were planned out. It was all music to Calvin's ears, because it distracted him. It prevented other things from rushing in. As he made it to the end of the lunch line, Calvin paid and spun around to hunt for a seat. He didn't eat in the cafeteria often, so he didn't have a usual table. He didn't really have friends to pal around with either. It was better that way. It kept him from losing his mind. Well, from losing it any more than he already had. Page 20. Calvin spotted an open chair in the corner of the room, a seat at a half-empty table that faced the wall. Ideal real estate. Oh, sorry. So he's saying a seat at a half-empty table that faced the wall. It means it's a good place to own. It's a good place to live. However, as Calvin set off to claim it, a hissing jerked his attention away that he couldn't help but turning to look. The kitchen doors had swung open, and a lunch lady had emerged, a fresh vat of bubbling sloppy Joe mix in her arms. She breezed past Calvin without incident. But in that brief window, before the doors could swing shut, Calvin had seen too much. Knives gleamed sharply on countertops. An unattended pot had started to boil over on the stove. A package of meat had been left out, bacteria colonies most likely claiming territory on its red rawness. Ew. Can you visualize that? Calvin blinked away, but having seen danger, his mind couldn't ignore it anymore. On the other side of the cafeteria, a table broke out in a chorus of happy birthday as a girl lit a couple of candles and stuck them in a cupcake. An apple fell off another table, rolling across the floor, getting kicked like a soccer ball, passed forward, just waiting for someone to miss, to step on it and be sent flying into the open jaws of the scorching hot dishwasher. Calvin blinked again, but he could only see hazard. He could only imagine worst-case scenarios. Accidents, broken bones, third-degree burns, cuts that would bleed out and require 15 stitches to seal back. The images flooded his brain. They set his heart racing. He gritted his teeth and tried to push them back. Page 21. But that didn't work. It never did. He took one last longing look at that empty chair in the corner of the room, the one where he would have been able to stare at the wall and eat his lunch in peace. Then he dropped his tray on a nearby table and booked it out of there, staring down at the floor so he wouldn't pick up anything else. I'm asking myself here, I'm wondering, for some reason, he thinks about dangerous things, and I think maybe the Mary in the mirror had something to do with it. All right, we're at the paragraph where it says, as Calvin set off. As Calvin set off down the empty halls, his feet took him where he needed to go. They carried him past the gym and down the science wing. They took him into the library and through the stacks to the back, depositing him in the reference section at a scrawled-on desk. Sitting, Calvin let his fingers wander across the old wood, feeling the grooves and gouges that generations of students had left behind. He'd sat here on so many afternoons that he had the map of scars memorized, the hearts and initials, the curses, the mindless doodles. So people that had sat there before him had written on the desk and carved in the desk. He took a deep breath and tried to clear his mind. But the itch from the cafeteria remained, an electric charge building in his fingertips, humming up his arms and moving through his whole body. Even here in his quiet place, encyclopedias and dictionaries and atlases surrounding him, Calvin could hear the whispers. He could see the premonitions flashing at him from the dust jackets wrapped around the thick books, and light reflecting off the protective plastic sleeves. They showed him paper cuts and broken toes, an earthquake shaking the heavy tomes right off, page 22, right off their shelves and onto his skull. So like he's thinking that he's going to get hurt in the library even. So he's sitting in the library and he's thinking that he's going to get paper cuts or the books are going to fall on his head. A domino of crashing bookcases that turned the whole library into a graveyard. This is all just in his head. Calvin shut his eyes and put his head down on the desk. But it did nothing to get rid of the images, nothing to keep the whispers from burrowing in. Finally, Calvin reached into his backpack and pulled out a notebook. He let it thud against the desk and then set his pen down next to it. He stared at the pen, not wanting to pick it up, but his fingers still itched, more intensely now than before. He hated doing it, but he knew it was the only way to silence the voices. His fingers curved around the pen while he flicked open his notebook with the other hand. He came to a white page and set the tip of the pen against it. He closed his eyes and let the whispers flood in, a soft muttering dragging him, pulling him along. He closed his eyes and let the whispers flood in, a soft muttering dragging him under and pulling him along. He saw flashes of wild hair tangled in knots, the thing's restless eyes dripping with red tears, its crimson lipstick clinging to its mouth like it'd just taken a long drink from someone's neck. Ew, another visualization. Calvin saw this demon's familiar face and the visions it spewed, cycling one after the other. His eyes snapped open, a blank look glazing them over, and his pen started scratching. It began filling the white pages with ink, with scenes too terrible to speak of. He remembered that day 5 years ago, page 23, when everything had changed, when he'd stood in front of that old mirror and whispered that name, Bloody Mary. He'd thought it was all a joke, but then something had tingled in his toes, a cold washing over him, flooding into his lungs, gripping his chest before it sank its claws into his heart, piercing him to the bone. He'd nearly collapsed from the pain, and then the thing that had appeared in front of him, filling the whole mirror, a vision that only he could see. It had loomed over him, its face monstrous, but still somehow beautiful. Its wicked grin was crowded with 2 rows of sharpened teeth. Its lips opened wide as if to devour him on the spot. Its bloodshot eyes, lined with crimson kohl, saw right through him, feasting on his every weakness, swallowing him in their ghastly depths. He'd blinked and the demon had vanished, but he hadn't been able to shake that feeling of doom, calamity waiting around every corner. The rules of Alina's game. He was meant for death. He thought his eyes had to be playing tricks on him, that it was just a made-up game. But the next morning, the visions had started. Terrible scenes had filled his head, living nightmares that he couldn't ignore or wake up from, catastrophes that he could only draw, that he was compelled to put to paper, that wouldn't stop. So remember in the last chapter, I'm making a text-to-text connection. Remember in the last chapter, Grace saw Calvin and he had dropped a picture that he was drawing behind. All right, this is page, it's covered. Must be page 24, the one before chapter 23. Calvin's eyes fluttered and he came to. His fingers ached from squeezing the pen so tightly, but he felt 100 times better, empty. But the relief only lasted a moment as he glanced down at his creations, at the 4 pieces of paper he'd unconsciously pulled out of his notebook and filled with ink, the lines crisscrossing and connecting across the white space. 4 separate drawings of 4 dire scenes. Dire means like drastic, horrible. So I'm monitoring for meaning. There's a little vocabulary. And then above it all, black lines flew off the pages, darkening the wooden desk, drawing all 4 pictures together under one monstrous umbrella. The demon's haunting face hunched over and looking on, reveling in the agony. Calvin studied the images, a cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck, unsure of what he'd drawn, of what it all meant. These felt different than his usual visions, more ominous. Ominous means something bad is about to happen. Remember, that was one of our vocab words. Like promises. He moved down the line and then paused over the last one. His fingers trembled as he lifted it, holding it close, making sure he hadn't missed something. An ache quivered in his heart, and his mouth went suddenly dry. Then he opened his notebook and shoved all 4 pictures inside. He pushed away from the desk and scurried out of the stacks, swearing that the demon's eyes followed him as he went taunting him over what was to come. Now, see if you can retell yourself what happened in that chapter. Talk about what Calvin remembered from 5 years ago, what he saw in the cafeteria, why he went running out of the cafe. See if you can tell yourself, why did he go running out of the cafeteria? And where did he go? And when he got to that place, what did he think about and what was he worried about? And then what was he drawing and why was he drawing it?